I'm joined with Dr. Christopher Gelly, who is a senior clinical research scientist at Google.
On that first day walking in, it was one of those great days of life, actually. I was like, wow. And all these people who I'd been following on Twitter, watching talks of, reading papers of, they were now my colleagues, which was just a sort of really exciting day, week, months, years that followed.
He also founded and successfully exited 2 internet companies, which have now been acquired. Everyday obsession will trump talent. Do you agree with that?
I think obsession is really important. I guess the obsession plus talent or multiplied by talent is probably the kind of octane mix, isn't it, that really ignites. It's rare to find a founder who's not obsessive.
When you first joined Google, how is it that they convinced you that they actually do care about healthcare?
Profit and health in the same sentence is very uncomfortable for us in the UK, isn't it?
We discussed the evolution of AI.
We are at a very interesting time. I don't think anyone has quite digested how it's going to feed into the world yet, and especially healthcare.
And of course, I couldn't let Chris go without talking about Google's research, AI in healthcare, and MedPalm 2.
The whole thing is mad, to be quite honest, and it's interesting that these things work.
You mentioned the term mad there, and I love the Arthur C. Clarke quote, which is, "Any significantly advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." Welcome back to Health Beyond Tomorrow. I'm joined with someone who I really struggled to script an introduction for today, and that's because this person has a very multifaceted journey which zigzags and blends clinical medicine, entrepreneurship, business, tech, investment banking. So I really struggled where to home down and actually begin introducing this person. I'm joined with Dr. Christopher Gelly, who is a neonatal intensive care doctor, as well as a senior clinical research scientist at Google. Alongside these 2 roles, Chris is also an angel investor in over 25 tech startup companies. Some you may have heard of, such as Deliveroo or Revolut. And additionally to that, he also founded and successfully exited 2 internet companies, which have now been acquired. So in this episode, we'll be exploring Chris's zigzag journey, his views on passion, and whether you need to be obsessive to be successful, and whether there's an ethical balance with merging healthcare alongside profit-driven big tech companies. We discussed the evolution of AI, specifically in the context of healthcare, starting all the way from the beginning with traditional programming methods to where we are now with generative AI models. And of course, I couldn't let Chris go without talking about Google's research around AI in healthcare, its applications, and MedPalm 2. So my name's Ash, and I'm the host of the Health Beyond Tomorrow podcast, where we talk about all things entrepreneurship, medical technology, and also the future of healthcare. So if you enjoy this episode, please make sure you hit that follow button wherever you're on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. It just helps the channel to grow, and it honestly means the world to me. It's free, so why not? I begin this episode by asking Chris to break down some pivotal moments in his career and what each step has taught him along the way.
Probably the biggest ones, I've been given a computer by my next door neighbour who worked for Xerox, and then just discovering coding. And I think that was a kind of quite a pivotal moment. And I realised that my mum, for example, wouldn't let me play games, but if she saw me making something, she'd leave me to it. So I think that kind of encouraged that behaviour. And sort of discovering making things, making robots, trying to make them to do stuff with a computer. I think that was very exciting. And then discovering the internet was another sort of big moment, and started making websites for people, wanted to make my own website, and then making a website that did this dialect translation into different British dialects. Seems stupid, but that was like probably my first sort of project, I suppose, of, you know, life or whatever. Hundreds of hours working on this thing that I was just really interested in. But then I think the next sort of milestone really is like launching it and finding people coming to it and quite enjoying it. And that this buzz that you can't really explain to someone else about how amazing that feels. So within about a couple of years, there were like 500,000 people a month coming to this website, which when you put it in terms of like Wembley stadiums per week, is kind of crazy. And all the feedback you get from it. And then realizing people like getting some benefit from it or enjoying it, or, you know, that's a real sort of drug that is quite amazing. And I think probably the rest of my life I've been trying to chase that feeling ever since. And then I guess deciding what to do, you know, deciding between engineering and medicine. And I think it was the medical students showing me around that made me think, this is the thing for me, because the medical student crew is an amazing bunch, I think. And they're such a diverse, fun group of people. Then in that first term of that first year, starting up the first company, and, you know, really should have been focusing on medicine, but it was a kind of really pivotal thing where you realize, wow, you can actually, you know, it's actually really easy to create a company. It doesn't take very long. Then the kind of getting into the swing of trying to make this thing grow and grow is also, I think, like another drug. So like you've got one drug seeing people using your thing, but another is actually seeing like development and growing of things. The thing where you go and you put one shovel of sand a day on this pile. It doesn't seem very much each day, but then when you step back at the end of the year and look, you made actually quite a big pile. Actually, like it took a whole year of shovels of sand to get to that pile. And that's another really nice feeling. That gives you this amazing energy. Going to lectures in the day, company at night, lectures at day, company at night, and also the other stuff you do as a student. And somehow you get all this energy because it gives you energy because it's so exciting. The company hit this roadblock the day before my first year exams, where I only had really one customer, and this one customer went bankrupt. And all of the money they owed me was just gone. And I have to say that was just this terrible, terrible period of life where you think, oh God, I'm going to go bankrupt too. It was going so well. And I think at that moment, I think a whole bunch of naivety was just washed away from me, because the people had been giving me excuses for months about why they hadn't paid their invoices. They were off skiing, or they'd lost their checkbook, or all sorts of crazy things. And I think just at that point, it's like, people aren't quite as trustworthy.
It all makes sense now.
Yeah, it all makes sense now. And I think since then, again, there's a little bit more streetwiseness about human nature or whatever. So that was really useful. And anyway, after that, there was a period of what happens now? But the decision to go for just big customers from now on, people who couldn't go bankrupt so easily. And the company sort of took off from there again and clawed its way out of debt, which was great. And then in my penultimate year, it got acquired. So that was a really nice sort of onward story. I guess another pivotal moment was then actually deciding to leave medicine for the first time, which was very controversial and many hours, and my poor girlfriend at university had many, many hours of discussions about this. But I guess everyone around me was leaving to go to the city. It's what everyone did in the 2000s. And I was really interested in business and didn't know anything about it, and this felt like a good thing to do. And with hindsight, it definitely added something to life. I wouldn't regret it in any way, and I think if others had these sort of inklings that something else might be more interesting, I think you just go and explore it, because you have now the satisfaction. You've gone there, you've tried it, you've enjoyed it, you learned some things, and you now have no regrets. Another maybe moment was this second company, which was a wedding website company. I think that was the thing, you just have to be passionate about what you do to really get that energy. You find yourself working day and night or whatever, you're just really engaged in it. I think if you're not quite engaged, it compounds over time, and you start to realize that this probably isn't what you should be doing. And so when that got an offer to be acquired, and sort of jumped at that opportunity, really. Another key moment, so I made an app as a pediatric SHO called Neomate. I had a bad experience where I really went blank after a bad resuscitation of a newborn, and I just couldn't prescribe a drug, which sounds stupid, but the neonatal infusions are pretty hard to do. And this app was basically made for me, by me, and I found it very useful. And then it's gone on to be sort of, I think, quite useful for others as well, who are in the same sort of situation, training as a pediatrician. And it won this NHS Innovation Award, and went to the awards ceremony, and the person giving out the awards was this guy called Professor Tony Young, who you may have come across. I was trying to talk to him afterwards, and he was, again, sort of surrounded by a swarm of people. So I just sent him an email afterwards saying, I think you seem to have a really cool job. How can I get this job when you finish? Or something, just like 2 sentences. And he replied saying, oh, let's go for a drink next week. And I have to say that was another sort of pivotal moment, because he was in the process of accumulating a sort of group of people who were interested in building companies in medicine. He took me and a group of others to exponential medicine. And that, again, was this sort of, whoa, gosh, there's a whole world out there that I didn't know existed. And the Americans, of course, do it in a very colourful and vibrant way, which I think in the UK we're a bit more reserved, aren't we? But
a bit more modest, yeah.
A bit more modest. But that was another thing, was that, wow. And at that moment, during that week, TensorFlow was released. And it's like, and that led to, I suppose, following the tutorials on the TensorFlow website, realizing that machine learning was really incredible, and even people who weren't particularly good at computing could train a model, and the models work surprisingly well. It's like, gosh, this is kind of crazy. If you can classify flowers, you can definitely classify moles, and that led to, just in the course of a PhD now, sort of getting interested in machine learning, and then sort of becoming a bit of a DeepMind groupie and trying to find my way into that group. If you imagine, before that, you're kind of really panicking that there's this amazing thing happening that you're not part of, and you really want to be part of it. And then all this effort to try and sort of work out what skills do you need to be useful there. On that first day walking in, it was like a kind of one of those great days of life, actually. I was like, wow. And all these people who I'd been following on Twitter, watching talks of, reading papers of, they were now my colleagues, which was just a really sort of, I don't know, really exciting day, week, months, years that followed. So I think they're probably the main moments over the last
Yeah, it's
Definitely.
fantastic. And here we are now.
And
You're
here
on
we
the
are now.
Health Beyond Tomorrow podcast. That's a funny story you mentioned of Tony. There's a swarm of students around him because that's exactly what happened with me coming up to you at Intelligent Health, where I literally got up out of my seat, rushed over to you, invited you on the podcast, and then there was about 10 other people just swarming you. And I thought, you know what, I might as well carry on this conversation afterwards. I have a question because throughout this 10 minutes where you've just summarized your whole life effectively in the story, you scream passion to me. You're clearly passionate about all the things that you've done, but all the things that you've done are quite random. So they're quite different. So you started off obviously coding in your bedroom to then setting a website just about different dialects. And then you set up a wedding company, which is just so different. Then you decided to go into investment banking. And then you obviously are now at Google. So there's all these different points in your careers, which are not even just zigzags, like it's completely unrelated. So tell me a little bit about the term obsession, because you mentioned that on Big Picture Medicine, and a lot of what you talk about resonated with me, because a lot of people do say that I'm a little bit obsessive. I get obsessed with these different fads over the course of a couple of years. And so, for example, people joke about this podcast being a fad, or people joke about a couple of years ago I was learning how to code and set up nodes on a blockchain. So tell me about this obsession. And then the follow-up question to that is, I don't know if you've seen the quote from the Adam Sandler movie where he's giving a really inspirational speech to this NBA basketball player. He's saying that everyday obsession will trump talent.
There's 1,000 other guys waiting in the wings who are obsessed with this game. Obsession's going to be talent every time. You got all the talent in the world, but are you obsessed?
So give me your perspective on that as well. Do you agree with that?
I think obsession is really important. I guess the obsession plus talent or multiplied by talent is probably the kind of octane mix, isn't it, that really ignites. But yeah, no, I definitely hear what you say. And I think obsession is really important. Well, I think curiosity is really important. I think if I were to ask, like, what would I like to be described by someone, I think I would like to be described as curious. If you're not curious, things are just going to pass you by, and you'll probably miss those things that resonate with you. I'm probably a little bit OCD. In that first company, I used to get teased for, like, saying, oh, I think that's like 1 pixel too much to the right. And I oh, it doesn't matter. Or, here at Google, I'm teased for my obsession with fonts, and I'll see that there's this is one size font different, or the font is subtly different weight or something. No one notices. I noticed, so it matters. I think, but also life is through ups and downs, isn't it? And you just need that person with a bit of obsession to get you through the downs, I think. So if you imagine you have a thing that's going really well and then suddenly it just goes worse and everyone stops believing, and it's you're probably just one step away from it going really well, and you just need a little bit of obsession to get over that hump. So I think that's important. It's rare to find a founder who's not obsessive. I mean, I think that's definitely a character trait that's important. And the energy and the enthusiasm, which is infectious to others, I think comes from that little bit of obsessiveness. And I was thinking a bit about clinical medicine is interesting, isn't it? I really enjoy clinical medicine, and the reason I'm still working at St Thomas's now in a very part-time way is because I can't seem to let go of it, and I really love it. But one thing I didn't like about it was the fact that you run on the treadmill all day, and then you hand the baton over to someone else, and then they run all night, and then they hand it back to you in the morning, and you run again during the day, and then and you're not doing that shovel on sand, the shovel of sand on a pile thing. And so there were pros and cons to that. One is you go home and you can sleep soundly at night because you know that your colleague is holding the baton for the night, and if anything happens, they're there. But the downside is you get to the end of your year and it's like, well, what have I achieved? So, well, I've learned a lot, and I've made some really good friends, and I've helped the people who I'm looking after. I've been a useful person in this system, but you haven't really built anything. In contrast, the academia, you're not really helping people day by day, and you've not got that direct impact, but you are building something over the course of the weeks. And I think that's where the obsessiveness can come in, because you basically don't stop thinking about it all the time. And the same with entrepreneurship, I think. It's with you while you're having dinner in the evening, while you're sort of at a movie. You just can't sort of let go of it a bit. So perhaps if you're a bit obsessive, you should try and calm yourself down. But there are definitely pros and cons, but I think obsessiveness is important.
You say curious is probably a better word. I'd probably prefer to be described curious over obsessive, right? If someone were to describe me. But yeah, super interesting, because people do say I'm obsessive, so I really did resonate with that. I mean, I went for a stage also where I wanted to learn how to cut my own hair, and And it was during COVID actually, and I think a lot of people might have gone through that stage, but I was stupidly obsessed with it. I bought all these trimmers and I learned how to cut my own hair, and then I was going around to my friend's house cutting their hair, getting money from it. And then since then I kind of lost touch with that obsession. Despite having gained that skill set of being able to cut my own hair and cut other people's hair. My follow-on question to that is, do you think there are any cons to being obsessive?
Yeah, well, I guess even so, it might blind you to things that because if you imagine you're on a project and you're just really obsessive about it and you can't see the wood for the trees, I think that probably can happen. And that's the case with a lot of founders as well, isn't it? They've done their various funding rounds, but they haven't quite got their product market fit, and they're sort of working out how they can keep going. But they keep that obsessiveness going, but don't really they're not flexible enough. I guess that's a problem area. It always might take over your life. I mean, I think probably some relationships have suffered in the past as a result of probably being a bit overly obsessive on these things, and that probably isn't good. And I've tried to be a bit more distant in my more recent life. Not distant, having a healthy gap between work and family and wider life. So yeah, I think that's important.
Speaking to loads of different founders, a lot of them say, especially in the early stage of startups, is being a perfectionist is one of the worst traits you can have, because obviously you need to get the product out there as soon as possible. If you wait until it is perfect, then the opportunity is already gone. It's too late. Yeah. And so somewhat of a juxtaposition there, because if you are obsessive, you are going to want to be perfect, make sure that the font is perfectly aligned, that every pixel is right. So yes, it's difficult sometimes to get away from that mentality, right?
One thing I love about the new world of technology is that, for example, if you and I wanted to set up a company, and 40 years ago we'd have to kind of go and rent a shop front and get really expensive signage and fit out the shop and whatever. But now we can actually create a really professional looking company or whatever, just for free for ourselves. Actually, if you can do some design and some set up, lay out a website and just to get some basic functionality going, or an app, for example, you can make an app for free. This is like a whole new world, isn't it? Where if you are a little bit obsessive and it works really slickly, you can't tell the difference between something made by a massive tech company and something you've made yourself. And that's pretty exciting, isn't it? Whereas you and I cannot recreate the Apple Store in Manhattan or something. It's just not possible. So I think maybe the obsession creeps into making that possible. If you make something that's a bit rubbish and it's got sort of Times New Roman all over the place, then I don't know. So I feel there are benefits at the same time.
So now you're at Google, and so I was speaking to Dr. Umang Patel, and he's at Microsoft at the moment, and he was telling me a little bit about a story of when he first joined Microsoft and how Microsoft convinced him that they actually do care about healthcare. And I guess one of the criticisms for doctors working for large profit-driven corporations like Google and Microsoft is do they actually care about healthcare when obviously working for a profit-driven company? Is there a care for patients, a genuine care for patients? When you first joined Google, how is it that they convince you that they actually do care about healthcare?
That's interesting. As you were saying that, I was thinking about some different bits. There's profit and health in the same sentence is very uncomfortable for us in the UK, isn't it? And that's Definitely. Not the case in other countries. And then there's a question, should doctors work in big tech companies, full stop, and do they really care? And then I think there's a bit as well of perception of others, maybe, what do people think about it? Profit in healthcare, just as a general topic, it is like a dirty word in the UK, and it puts off people from doing stuff that is outside of the NHS public sector. But I genuinely think that a lot of the best innovations have come and will come from profit-driven enterprises. And when if a doctor is saying, "Oh, I want to leave the NHS to start a company," well, you should really encourage them, because that's really bold, isn't it? That's something that's quite outside of the norm. Why not? If it goes wrong, you can come back. And you really shouldn't be looked down on, I don't think. In the US, it's really encouraged. All the professors at the big universities and academic institutes in the US also have a spin-out company. It's just totally part of the culture there, whereas it really isn't here. And so I'd love to see more people doing this in general. And I'm sure that is the route to us trying to fix the NHS. And I feel like tech companies is not dissimilar. You are further away from the individual person, but you do have these amazing platforms. So, for example, at Google, we have a clinical team. This is a team of people who are genuinely really passionate about how technology can improve the health of the planet. The motto is billions of healthy people. And it's quite an opportunity, isn't it? If you think about, imagine YouTube. YouTube, I would argue, is the world's greatest public health platform ever invented. It reaches the entire world, anyone with a data connection, and if you want to learn something about your health, what a great place to start. But wouldn't you want to make sure that there are doctors in that team who are saying, well, look, this is a great opportunity. Let's make sure that we surface the right information to the right people, that we try and suppress misinformation that could send someone off down the wrong path. So I feel like we should have doctors there, and I think it's a great opportunity if you have that opportunity to work there. Like, wow, what a great thing. I think there was a news article recently saying like almost 10% of searches or 7% of searches are health related. So if Google has that mission, organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful, and then there's another mission about focus on the user and all else will follow, which I think is good. And I've seen that. When I wasn't working at Google, I was always quite impressed that they did just focus on the user, even if it had a short-term impact on revenue. It leads to this long-term growth of a great company. And if like a large proportion of your users are looking for health information and you're just focused on the user, I think this leads you to at least have the incentive to build really good products. So the other funny thing is people talk about a company as this sort of thing, but really it's all the people within it. And the people within it that I work with on a daily basis are really lovely people. And that's one of the biggest things that would keep me at Google for a long time, is just this amazing team of even, there are people whose background is in health and they probably have a good reason to remain interested in health. But the engineers, the computer scientists, machine learning engineers, they're really passionate about how you can use machine learning to drive real change in healthcare. And that's very exciting. So I think like on a daily basis, the people I work with definitely personify what you're hoping, I think, you would see inside a company like Google. It's an interesting company that's doing really fascinating research. It's basically like a university in many ways, except you've got sort of masses of sort of resources and compute power and great teams around you and lots of building blocks to build upon. So it's almost like a really fertile environment to do quite good work in this space at this time, I think.
So yeah, tell me a bit about your role at Google then. What are you up to currently?
Yeah. I work now in a research team in the Google's artificial intelligence research team. We have a health bit of it, we call Health AI. And that is basically a team that just tries to catalyze the world of adopting AI in healthcare. I started off as a sort of clinical research scientist, which means that you're kind of the person in the team who's trying to, I guess, identify a good problem, sort of encourage people that this is the way that we should work and this is the problem that we should attack, and then sort of tell a good story at the end. And in a research arc, that means sort of writing up a paper or telling the story or explaining why it's useful. More recently, I've been acting more as a product manager in research, and that means your job is, again, not that dissimilar, but it's thinking what should be working on, trying to corral people into working on that problem, and then really sort of selling the story to anyone who will listen, really, and try and think, where does this go next? So it's a little bit more sort of strategic, I suppose, in some ways.
And you gave a fantastic talk at Intelligent Health. You broke down really well the evolution of programming, machine learning, from obviously traditional methods to supervised learning, and then now to the generative AI models that we're seeing. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about this on the podcast, because I think there is a huge lack of understanding amongst the medical student demographic.
We are like at a very interesting time, right now, in the last 9 months or something. There's like a whole new sort of era beginning. I don't think anyone has quite digested how it's going to feed into the world yet, and especially healthcare. So but yeah, the background is if you go back like 30 years or something, things that we might have called AI would be these sort of like decision tree type tools or if you wanted to say classify something, you might have to sort of do some really handcrafted engineering. So imagine you wanted a cat or a dog, you'd think, okay, what makes a cat, what makes a dog? Cat's got these whiskers, dog's got this shaped nose, and then you'd sort of try and write code that would tick off these things in a list. And if it's ticked all the cat boxes, then this is a cat. And if it ticks all the dog boxes, it's probably a dog. A good example is like Google Translate, which had hundreds of thousands of lines of code. This is really handcrafted. Bring in linguists from all around the world. Like, so much human expertise goes into building these systems, but they have a certain limit on performance. And then you fast forward into the supervised learning era, which is like 2012 onwards-ish. And the idea there was, here's a learning algorithm that can actually learn things for itself. You don't actually have to teach it exactly why something is the case. All you have to do is give it examples. So machine learning is of learning from data. And so in that case, you might assemble 10,000 cats and 10,000 dogs. You run them through this learning algorithm, and the model learns to adjust its weights. These are kind of it's like a complex network of mathematical operations, but it's able to adjust its own weights to try and make sure that, as it's training, to make sure that it gets closer and closer to calling a cat and a dog a dog. And at the end, just through learning and through examples, they actually surpass the human abilities of classifying images. And that was kind of that was the moment that everyone was like, wow, this is exciting, and led to things like your smartphone. You can now just search for blue boat, and it will look for all the blue boats in your photo library. That something that I don't think people find that impressive, but that was really impressive when that first came out. Now it's completely normal, which is cool, I suppose. But also, if you can do salamanders versus newts, you can also do melanomas versus benign moles, or diabetic retinopathy versus normal retinas. The only difference really, you have the same learning algorithm. The only difference is the training data that you feed in. And so that was like a big moment forwards. And a lot of the things that we're seeing trying to get to healthcare right now are that era. It's called supervised learning, where we supervise the algorithm by giving it labels. The downsides to that are that you have to have good quality training data. You kind of train these models on like a 0 or a 1. So basically, you've got to decide, what am I training for? You're doing breast cancer. You get a group of scans, and you get someone to go through them and give them all 1s if they're breast cancer and 0s if they're not. And then the model learns to give a score between 0 and 1. And somewhere you cut it in half and say anything above 0.7 is cancer and everything below 0.7 is not. And that's how you sort of break it out into the classification. And that is expensive. People around the world have spent millions and millions and millions of pounds of dollars getting expert specialists to label images so they can train their algorithms. And that's been one of the reasons why we haven't done more of it, I think, is because the cost of just training these algorithms is really high in terms of the labeling that's required to get good quality models. And then fast forward to last year, and sort of the rise of this generative AI era is very interesting. And this all came from a Transformers paper that Google published in 2017, I think it was. And it just opens up a new way of doing things. And so you get these models to learn by trawling vast amounts of data. And in the case of text, it's learning to predict the next word, basically, in a sequence. So the transformer element introduced this concept called attention. Attention is really interesting because it allows the model to focus really well on the context of each word within a sentence in a way that wasn't possible before, with these very long gaps. Like a word here can be related to this word here, which means like a cat sat on the. You could do a distribution over what the next word should be. It's probably Matt, isn't it? But if the sentence before said the cat walked up to a chair, a cat sat on the. It's not going to be. You'd change the order of words to be chair, probably, wouldn't you? And so that's the kind of the very basic idea behind transformers. And things that become possible there are. Well, you've seen things like sort of ChatGPT, which really took the world by storm as people realised the capabilities of these tools. The ability to kind of solve quite complicated problems in ways we didn't think were possible. This sort of frictionless interface. Humans talk as we are talking in speech. The algorithm can now sort of respond in speech, which is pretty amazing. Some work we published shows how you can go from the 0s and 1s in training to just training on radiology images and their free text. So you don't actually have to really curate the data in such a way. And actually the model starts learning this nuance. Because obviously radiologists don't write malignant. They write, this has a suggestion of something, and this feature suggests something, and you can tell whether they're definite or definitely not, or a bit in the middle somewhere. There's a lot of nuance in the report. And these models start to learn that nuance. And you can start to do things like, does this report match this image? And the model might say, no, it says left pneumonia, but I see a pneumonia on the right. This just wasn't possible in the era before. So basically, we're just in a new era of trying to work out what these technologies can do. And I think the next 5 years is going to be interesting. If there's anything like this, the previous era of convolutional neural networks from the last 10 years, you have this spark moment where everyone's like, whoa, this is incredible. And then there's a kind of period of people just digesting it. And only really now are we seeing these things entering the world in a really kind of meaningful way. And I suspect the next 5 years is going to be very interesting to watch.
And obviously I couldn't let you go without talking a little bit about MedPalm 2. I saw the study that was released by Google. You spoke about the progression of MedPalm and how it's been answering USMLE questions. And MedPalm completely smashed all the other models that that were currently, like PubMed GPT, and got 67%, and was the first language model to actually get above that 60% pass mark. And then MedPalm 2 came out and it completely smashed that as well and got like 85%, right? And so tell me a little bit about the progression of MedPalm to now MedPalm 2 and what's been done in developing it and fine-tuning it so it's just progressively getting better and better.
I think that the team's done like an amazing job of trying to call it fine-tuning these models for a particular task. And I think the progression from MedPalm 1 to MedPalm 2 just reflects the evolution of experience that's been gained over the last 6 months or so. One of them is just fine-tuning the model. So you train on this massive corpus of data on the internet, but then you can fine-tune it further by providing it with more specialized data to kind of continue its training. And that allows it to perform better at these tasks that you're really aiming for. But also it's about sort of prompting strategies. And I guess you've probably come across like prompt engineering as a kind of nascent field that people are interested in. These models are kind of fascinating. And the way that you deal with them, people keep suggesting new strategies every week, you know, about how you might gain more from them. And the weird thing about it is you can just try them yourself on your favorite language model. You know, some of the things that you can try, you can give. So when you give your task at the beginning and you give some examples, and this is like sort of few shot prompting. So you say, I want you to do this task. Here are some good examples of what I'm looking for. Question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. Now answer this question. And that sort of helps. I guess if you think about the model, it's got the whole world's sort of data in its mind. You're kind of showing the type of answer you're looking for. So kind of that helps it hone down its answer. There are these things called chain of thought you may have come across. And this is like an interesting idea where you ask the model to break down its reasoning. So like if you ask remember in our GCSE maths, you had like 8 points to working and 1 point for the answer or something. Much the same, you ask the model to explain it in a step-by-step method. And the intuition behind that is interesting. Like every run through the model is kind of very similar, like it's a similar amount of compute. And if you ask it to do a really complicated thing in one run through the model, it may not have got quite enough time to sort of work out the answer. If you ask it to break it down into lots of steps, reasoning steps, it involves multiple tokens, multiple new words being predicted by the model. It kind of allows it more compute. So if you imagine, say, give me an answer, yes or no, yes. But if you say, break it down into it step by step, give me the step-by-step reasoning, it then goes over maybe paragraphs and then finishes with a yes. You've allowed it just that much more compute time to kind of come to the right answer. And it turns out that makes a big, big difference. Other things, there was one called self-consistency, which is thinking about you ask it to do the same thing many times, and you identify lots of different routes to the correct answer, and then you kind of marginalize the incorrect ones, which is a very interesting idea. Or there's one called ensemble refinement, which is where you ask it to do the same thing many times. It's obviously like it's a sort of probabilistic model, so it can give different answers each time. And you then say at the end, you say, here's the question. Various students have given these answers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, down to 10. Review their answers and then come up with your own final answer. It's like it's like an interesting idea where you kind of ask it to do it 10 times, then you're asking itself to rate itself, which actually it's quite good at. And all of these things give little boosts. There's actually one recently that I saw, again from a team that includes Google, called Tree of Thought, which is where you say, here's an interesting question. I would like you to imagine 3 experts answering this question, 3 different experts from different fields, and I want you to go through different rounds of discussion. And if any expert realizes that they're wrong, they should leave, and then finally come to a final answer. And by doing this, you kind of ask the model to take on different personas. And it's weird to try. I have this favorite question I always ask all the LLMs, who would win in a fight, a stegosaurus or a tiger, or something that's kind of implausible. And the model might say, oh, well, I'm going to do a paleontologist, a zoologist, and a combat strategist. And then each of them has their own sort of a way of approaching that question. And then they sort of interact through the course of the answer. And you do actually find quite good answers at the end. The whole thing is mad, to be quite honest. And it's interesting that these things work. And they work really well. So there's a whole evolution of more strategies that could be done, I think, down the line. But prompting is just a really interesting thing. So I've gone a little bit off track. But a lot of these things have come into the MedPalm 2 paper. And I think these all just boost the performance, each one. And there's more to come in the future, of course.
You mentioned the term mad there, and I love the Arthur C. Clarke quote, which is any significantly advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I remember the first time I tried out GPT, and I was thinking to myself, wow, that is crazy. And yeah, so tell me a little bit about how I guess we can start teaching med students these different ways of prompting, because it's something I'm quite passionate about as well. It is educating the students or doctors that are coming into clinical practice around these different tools and how they can be not just conversing with these language models, but actually using these different approaches to get different responses out of these language models.
And that's the big question, isn't it? I think like a lot of these things, it's easy to get 80% of the way to something that's really impressive. And that's maybe that first magical burst. And that happens with the CNN era too, like, wow, this thing can classify melanomas really well or something. But then the last 20% is getting it into practice in a safe way that doesn't harm people, that is beneficial to society. And that is the really hard bit. And it becomes extra hard in this new era. So in the past era, it was a score between 0 and 1 for a disease label, if you summarize it really aggressively. In this new world, you have this thing that can output very rich responses. Because it's like a statistical model, it is outputting the most plausible thing that it thinks would fit with what you're asking. So there are many examples that I've found on sort of Twitter or whatever, where a professor of some field has said, wow, look at this, it's answered this question and given me references, how incredible. And then the reply to it is like, you do know those references don't exist. And then the next reply is, oh, really? Oh, and it's weird because in its output, it has put the right author names and the right combinations, the right sort of years and the right sort of journals, so that even the top person in the field is like, oh, of course, that was John publishing in the journal of blah, 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 blah. But actually, you do actually have to check that. And that's where these models are sort of a little bit, maybe need to be careful with them, because they can write plausible things that are incorrect. And so I suppose the next journey is, while also improving the models, is thinking about how we can make these models safe and fair and, not making up stuff, grounded in reality. From the point of view of, say, someone who's like one of us who's working in the field of medicine, I think it's just about getting familiar with them, because there's definitely an intuition you can build, and I think now is a good time to start, because I'm sure these are going to dominate our life to come. So, for example, when I'm working on the NICU, I find myself asking it little questions and just seeing how it responds. I have a baby here on these ventilator settings, and the gas is this. What would you recommend doing? Just to see what happens. And it's surprising how quite often it says, oh, I would nudge up the tidal volume to da, 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 which is amazing, isn't it? That's sort of the fact that it can take a status of a baby, a blood gas, interpret which bits are wrong, and then understand what about the ventilator is the thing that would probably be the best thing to tweak. That is a magical, mind-blowing thing for me to experience, because it is just predicting the next word. But there's a lot of things going on in that prediction of the next word. But equally, sometimes it will write something that is not true. And I think it takes experience and playing with them just to start to get a feel for what it does and what doesn't do well. And probably by doing that, you'll start to maybe have an idea, well, maybe we could use it for this, or maybe we could use it for this. And from there, lots of flowers probably bloom. So I would just encourage everyone to get started and just trying them with little questions, but having a very healthy skepticism that what it outputs may not be true, fact-checking it with search, which we do know that's one of the benefits of search, is you put a query in and it just gives you things that other people have written. Like, here's a Mayo Clinic patient information sheet on blah. That is basically a fancy librarian service, which is really customized for you. The difference of this is that it's actually generating new text for you personally, answering precisely the question that you asked it's trying to. And that's where the danger creeps in. So it's a very interesting time, and I'm fascinated to see where it leads.
I always find it interesting how these language models do make stuff up, because we do liken like GPT or whatever it is somewhat a human conversation, right? And we liken it to human cognition. And it's interesting because humans do make stuff up, they do lie. Mm-hmm. And so I see it as somewhat similar, which is super strange to think that it's somewhat a symptom of these models that they confabulate similarly to how humans will say a white lie in a conversation, which is completely fascinating.
It's almost like the personalities that some people, you'll ask them a question and they'll say, oh, I really don't know. You should probably go and ask Jane. She's much better at this. Others might be like, well, I can have a stab at that. And just different people. And I guess the models are a little bit more on the, I will try and answer anything you ask me. And
Even
I
if
think
it's wrong.
one of the keys is bringing in this sort of type of, actually, I don't know, but I would find out through another means would be that's one of the great challenges, I think.
Just as we close up, what are you most excited for in the next 10 years of healthcare?
I think I'm really interested to see that first wave of AI hit the world. There's been like a decade of work on trying to make models, almost a decade of work, trying to make models that can improve a narrow task well. Can you do lung cancer, breast cancer, dermatology diagnoses better, more efficiently, more resource efficient, closer to home, more acceptable to people? Like, these are really exciting things, and I really want to see them actually hit the world. They're so close. They're on a tipping point, I think, right now. I think the main challenge left is the end of the evidence generation and human change. Like, people saying, yes, let's try it. Like, the openness and the breaking down of sort of unnecessary red tape that stops these things coming in. I think we're going to see that, and I hope we don't stop. Like, I really want to see that story play out, and in a parallel, this sort of news story build up about how the generative AI era is going to hit health. And I think that's probably a whole new wave of evolution and R&D that's going to start. So I'd like to see them going in parallel, so that the next wave can build upon that first wave. And if that can happen, it's kind of hard to predict. It's hard to imagine, like, even a year or two away, let alone 5 or 10 years. It's very exciting, and I can't wait to see what happens, really.
It's been my pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.